Welcome to the Psych Central Show, where each episode presents an in-depth look at issues from the fields of psychology and mental health. With your host, Gabe Howard, and featuring Vincent M. Wales.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Psych Central Show. My name is Gabe Howard, and of course, Vincent M. Wales is here as well. Vince, say hi like you always do.
Hi, like I always do.
We are excited this week. We have a very special guest with us. Paul Gilmartin is with us. He is the host of Mental Illness Happy Hour. And he's an all-around cool guy. I didn't realize it at the time. I was a fan of Mental Illness Happy Hour, but I was also a fan of his previous work, which was Dinner and a Movie on TBS. And I totally didn't realize that you were the same person. So welcome.
I didn't either. So it was very confusing.
It's interesting how often I watch 80s movies and I realize that there was a cameo by some star that is famous now. The other day, I realized it is. I realized that Macaulay Culkin was an Uncle Buck. I just always thought that was a John Candy movie.
Yeah, the kid with the big pancake, just asking him all the questions, and kind of deadpanned.
He was doing it all. So, Paul, we wanted to have you on our show for a couple of different reasons. One, you're the host of the Mental Illness Happy Hour, which is a great show that has some pretty public people, some very public people, in fact, discussing mental health issues and addiction issues very, very openly. And that's something that we don't see a lot of. So that was very interesting to us. And also when we were doing the research to do our show, the Psych Central Show, the one that you're on now, a lot of people said, hey, that sounds a lot like the Mental Illness Happy Hour. And we thought, really? Let's check this show out. And that's sort of when we became aware of it. So you led the way for us to have our show, and some of the stuff that we're trying to do here, you're already doing. So first off, thank you for paving the way for us.
Oh, I appreciate that.
And second, the big question that I think the audience is going to want to know is, how do you get famous people on your show, and what's that like?
You ask them, or you ask a friend of theirs, or you ask their representative. But a lot of times it's no. It's a lot of no's. You just keep doing it. I've been lucky enough to have somebody help me reach out to people because I just couldn't take it after a while, all the no's. And so I reached out to my friend Megan. She's so good. She's such a go-getter. And so now I'll just shoot her an email and say, hey, would you try getting this person on? But a lot of the guests are people I've known from the comedy world. So that's been another way to get them, because I used to do stand-up as well. So I know a lot of people in that community. But one of my goals was to have, there's such a myth of celebrity and money in our society that if you have those things, you'll find peace. And I know that is a myth. And so I thought it would be great to have somebody who's in the public eye one week and then somebody who is not in the public eye the next week, and see how similar the feelings are that they struggle with. So that's been one of the goals. Probably a third of the guests on my show are listeners, and that wasn't planned in the beginning. That was something that just kind of evolved as I began to see and hear from listeners as they would email me their stories. I would be like, oh my God, this would make a great episode. Yeah, that's been another way that the show has evolved.
Just out of curiosity, Paul, you say that listeners email you. How frequently does that happen?
Every day.
Every day.
Yeah.
That's a lot of email. I know that when we emailed you, we got a nice autoresponder back that said that you get so much email that it sort of became overwhelming and that you were unable to answer it, which we're sort of aware of because we know that there's a lot of need in the mental health and addiction community, and there's not enough people to provide it.
Yeah, and it's a really good test of my codependence issues, because I have to remind myself I can't save anybody. I can just try to be of service, do a good job, be a good person, but I have to make sure that my battery stays charged. The times that it gets overwhelming is when my computer will screw up and send a bunch of emails to junk mail, and then I'll discover all of them in there, and all of a sudden I'll have 128 emails to personally reply to. And I try to reply to everyone. Oftentimes it's just a matter of how much time can I dedicate to this email. So sometimes it's lengthier than others. Other times it's just like, I'm glad you like the show, or thank you for your constructive criticism, or whatever. I appreciate your support. Other times it's more detailed, especially if it's an issue that I personally have battled that isn't discussed a lot. Then I will oftentimes have a more detailed response, and oftentimes questions for them. And a lot of times, if it's somebody on the cusp of going to their first therapy session, I will ask them to check back in with me, because I want to be able to report those experiences to other people who are in their shoes, to say, hey, look, this person had those same fears, and here's what happened.
That leads me to my next question. Where did the idea for the mental illness happy hour come from?
I went off my meds, thought I was fine. 5 months later, I wanted to kill myself and didn't realize it was the depression for probably a month. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, this is the depression coming back. Because I thought, if it's going to come back, it'll come back within 3 months. But no, apparently sometimes it takes longer. And,
it is weird, isn't it?
Yeah, and I thought that, go ahead.
Depression can sneak up on me and actually be messing with my life for a month before I even realize what's going on.
Yeah, because it will present itself as your life sucking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Friends will notice it, and they'll notice the change in your behavior, and then for some reason they just don't say anything, I guess maybe because they want to be polite, or they don't want to, bring up the whole mental illness thing or what have you, but then that kind of just blindsides you when you do realize it.
It really does. It really does. And I thought to myself, when I realized that's what it was, I went back on my meds, and within 3 or 4 days I was feeling better. And I realized I believe that depression is a real thing. I've been in therapy. I'm in support groups. I see a psychiatrist, and I was fooled by it. Imagine the people out there that don't believe in taking meds, that don't believe depression is a real thing, that think it's a moral weakness or a matter of attitude. My God, somebody has to talk about this in a way that is compelling, because I saw a need for it to be done in a way that wasn't like a lecture, or wasn't really precious and new agey and people talking about Mother Earth and, releasing your buttocks into your chakra and that other stuff. I thought, I'll take the kind of conversations we have in my support groups and that I have with my comedian friends, but we'll just change the subject matter. And so that was the idea for it. I realized that people have information at their disposal, tons of other places, but what they don't get is comfort. They need that hand reaching out and holding their hand and laughing with them and crying with them.
Agreed. And medical issues, whether it's mental illness, physical illness, etc., they're boring. I mean, I don't want to sit around and talk about somebody's broken leg, because I don't need to hear how bones break and how they heal together and what the body does when this happens. That would bore me. But the reason that I understand so much about broken legs is because when somebody breaks one, they have this cool story to go with it. They fell off their motorcycle, they were climbing a tree. I mean, it's almost like a battle scar that a lot of adults, when they broke limbs as children, are now proud of. So we were able to learn all of this about broken limbs because it was just told in such a way that was fascinating. And it's one of the things that we try to do here on the Psych Central Show, but it's one of the things that you're able to do very, very well over on your podcast, because in order to understand the joke, you have to know what's going on, and you explain it in such a way that makes us want to understand the story. And that's what really engaged me personally, because I thought, wow, this is such dry material that you've livened up in such a way that's funny and emotional.
Well, thank you.
So it's
thank you, because nothing gets through to people like a story. Nothing.
Which is why I'm a writer.
Yeah, it's the best. I never get tired of hearing stories. It's why I love documentaries so much. I'll watch documentaries on subjects I don't even care about.
Well, there's a good example to pull this in. Super Size Me is a documentary that people have learned about. Now, nutrition and obesity are something that has not been well understood in our society, even though we're all worried about obesity. But the gentleman that made Super Size Me, he did it in such a way that it was entertaining. A lot of people were watching that movie because they thought it was funny. And then when they left, they're like, well, now wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't eat McDonald's 3 times a day or it's going to be unhealthy. So I don't know what the mental illness Super Size Me equivalent is, but there's $1 million idea out there for somebody. We're just giving it away.
Yeah, what I loved about that movie was you had more compassion for people who struggle with obesity. And he didn't even get into the emotional reason of people that struggle with weight. He covered it from the perspective of people being poor and it being convenient and then being pressed for time.
One of the things you said is that you went off your meds and you went off your meds for depression, correct? That's your diagnosis?
Yeah, depression and anxiety, yeah.
Depression, anxiety. And you said at the top of the show that you wanted to show that celebrity didn't insulate you from, things like mental illness. And I mean, you're a good example of that. You were on television for 16 years, which is an incredible run by any standard. And you couldn't avoid it.
No, in fact, the times I was most financially successful and had the most visibility, I was the most suicidal because all I cared about was myself. And, I didn't have a spiritual life. And I don't mean a religious life. I mean, I didn't care about really anybody else. I didn't care about trying to make the world a better place. I just wanted to be out of my pain, but I had no tools to do it. And I was battling clinical depression, which is really just kind of diabetes, but of the brain. It's a chemical imbalance that no amount of praying or meditating or exercising is going to get rid of, in my case.
We do get a lot of that, though. A lot of people saying that there are alternatives to medication and to therapy and all of that. And I'm like, well, you know what? If that works for you, that's great. But I'm not going to recommend it to anybody personally.
Now, people that shame other people for taking meds don't realize how dangerous that is. Just because something works for you, don't. I agree that meds should be the last house on the block. Try everything else, unless you're in crisis. But I'm a believer in trying everything else. And I have tried everything else. And I do need that and meds. So I do all of that.
And that's what we find with a lot of people. In some cases, I think the people that are advocating for people not to take medication, I think that their heart is somewhat in the right place. Our society does look for quick fixes. And as sure as we're all sitting here, there is somebody that is taking psychiatric medications that may not need them. The problem is it's very dangerous because people suffering from mental illness, they often feel isolated and alone as it is. And then you've got somebody pressuring them to stop the treatment that's working. They're not able to fight that off. And, it's very, very problematic. And like you said, you were financially solvent. You had money, success. You even had fame, which is something that most people don't have. And you still felt isolated and alone and vulnerable. And that's why we have to be careful for, people that are sitting with less resources, both financial and, friends, family, support, etc. They're just very vulnerable.
And the other thing that is a hallmark of depression is decisions are difficult to make. So if you throw in somebody questioning your ability to take meds, you throw in the stigma of meds and this myth that it means you're weak. That's a lot. That's a lot putting somebody up against.
So let's go back to your show for a moment. Who is your favorite interview? Who did you interview that you feel that you learned the most from or that taught your audience the most and why?
Wow.
Dude, he's got 300 and some episodes. How's he going to pick?
Yeah. This week's episode really, really touched me. It's Charlie King, and he's a guy I've known for a long time, and he had one of the most abandoning childhoods I've ever heard of. and he descended into crack and violence and falling in love with unavailable, abusive women. It's a heartbreaking story, but ultimately Charlie turns his life around and begins to see clearly what is really going on inside of him. It's a really inspiring issue. I think that some of the episodes that resonated most deeply with me were the ones where it touched on issues that I still struggle with. I didn't realize that what I experienced as a child was a form of incest by my mom. And I didn't really have that epiphany until about a year and a half into doing the podcast. So the listeners kind of got to hear me spread through many episodes, struggle with that and struggle with cutting my mom out of my life. And the people that helped me, the first episode with Dr. Jessica Zucker, we had her on around 3 times, but the first episode, that was the one that kind of cracked it open for me. As far as people's stories that were really almost like movies, there's a woman named Nadare Fenoyan, and she was she was on the run from the Ayatollah. She's Iranian, and she was a Marxist when the Ayatollah came to power, and they were hunted down by the Ayatollah's people. And let's put it this way, it was a 2-hour episode, and we didn't even touch on the fact that she is a nurse in a psych ward.
Oh, wow.
Here in the States now. Yeah. The episode with Christine Keys, Keese, she was a child in the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. God, there's so many. Teresa Strasser is a great episode. That, in a nutshell, is kind of what the show is at its best. It's a good blend of humor, raw vulnerability, and insight. And she was a great guest. She's one of my favorite episodes. There is a page on our website that has the listener favorites, top 10 listener favorites from every year. So that might be a good place to start.
Well, that's fantastic. So we're unfortunately near the end. We have time for one more question. Vin, do you want to ask it or should I?
Oh, wow. Just one, huh? Well, why don't you go? And if your question stinks, then I'll go.
That's true. And we'll edit mine out. What's it like being so vulnerable? I mean, you're used to being in the public eye because of your, hosting the television show, being a stand-up comedian. So obviously you're not a person that has a problem sort of leading a public life, but this is different. This is leading a public life about very personal things. Can you speak on that for a moment? There's not even really a question, just what's it like?
It's fantastic, but I avoided it my whole life. I avoided it until I got sober at 40. And even then, I didn't really dive into the deepest issues, the issues with my mom, the issues with being sexually violated by my mom. But it was in a way that was really covert, so I didn't recognize it as such until I saw the pattern as a whole. But the support group that I went to for that, which helped me have those epiphanies, that was a support group that stressed the importance of vulnerability, letting go of the shame. And that's where I got to let go of my deepest, darkest shames, the feeling that I was dirty, the feeling that it was my fault, or I was making it up, or I was a baby, or I should be able to handle it. That was the template for starting the podcast, because I realized how powerful vulnerability was. But I had never been vulnerable in my comedy. My comedy was a wall up until then. So this is relatively new to me, but it has changed my life. It has allowed deeper connections, and those deeper connections is what I was really looking for in money and recognition, but could never get.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. You've really created a space for people to not only be vulnerable to the public, but for the public to see people who are vulnerable, and that allows them to move forward in their own lives. So you've really done a great job of figuring out education versus entertainment in a great way. And it's fun to listen to as well. Even I learn stuff, and I'm living with mental illness every day. So I can imagine that for the true layperson, somebody that doesn't know somebody or live with it themselves, they're getting quite the education accidentally. And that's fantastic. So we appreciate all the work you do.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on the show.
All right, everybody. If you liked us, please subscribe to us on iTunes. Give us a rating and a review. Like us. We have to beg for it at every episode. Paul is beating us in the ratings, so really, I think we could catch up if you just give us a hand. So, Paul, thank you for being on the show. Vin, as always, thanks for tolerating me. And everybody, we will see you next week.
PsychCentral.com is the internet's oldest and largest independent mental health website. Psych Central is overseen by Dr. John Grohall, a mental health expert and one of the pioneering leaders in online mental health. Our host, Gabe Howard, is a professional speaker, award-winning writer, and mental health advocate. You can find more information on Gabe and his work at GabeHoward.com. Vincent M. Wales is an award-winning speculative fiction novelist and suicide prevention crisis counselor. You can find more information on Vincent at vincentmwales.com. If you have feedback about the show, please email talkback@psychcentral.com.